The Meet Me for Coffee podcast is on site this week at the Journal of Commerce Inland Distribution Conference 2025 here in one of my favorite cities, Chicago. I'm excited to have a lot of speakers on the show this week, and we're going to be bringing some great content and hearing a lot of really great insights about what's going on in our industry and the broader supply chain. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the last day of the Journal of Commerce Inland Distribution Conference. Meet Me for Coffee podcast is here on site recording, and I am so grateful to be joined by my friend Paul. Paul, how are you doing?
Very good. So good to be with you today, Samantha.
Absolutely. I got to have you on my regular show not too long ago.
That's right.
For the first time since the podcast started a couple years ago, and that was a lot of fun for me because I love all of your work. And so I got to listen to you give your session yesterday here at Inland and really enjoyed all the insights. So I said I have to have him on the podcast so he can share those with everyone else. So thank you for making the time.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to join you. You've got such a tremendous audience that you draw to hear all the insights that all your guest speakers are bringing regularly, and I'm sometimes envious of who you get to talk to. So it's a thrill to be here.
Well, awesome. Would you mind briefly introducing yourself and telling anyone who doesn't know who you are and what you do?
Right. So I'm Paul Bingham. My title is Director of Transportation Consulting in the Global Insight Unit of S&P Global Market Intelligence, which is a long mouthful. My job is actually economic analysis of freight transportation and forecasting of international trade and freight commodity movements across all modes of transport. Working with macroeconomists, industry economists, regional economists, and trade economists in our company. There's several hundred economists in S&P who make my job easy because I can rely on their expertise to do the forecasting work and the analysis that we do. And then we bring it to those that are the decision makers, those that are the investors and the shippers and the supply chain managers, even government policy makers, in terms of aspects of the freight transportation system, from investors at Wall Street to those that are actually operational, running individual parts of the network, trying to give them a heads up, learn what to plan for, maybe even do some contingency planning and scenario planning when there's periods of uncertainty, to help them do their jobs better and be happier in doing their work.
Well, yesterday the session was the North American Economic and Freight Market Outlook. It was exactly geared around that, helping people plan for the year ahead to end this year. So I'd love to hear, you got to go first in that lineup of speakers, I think, and kind of give your contributions. So I'm going to give you the floor here again. I'd like to hear what you shared.
Well, thank you. So in that panel, for those that were not able to be here, I was joined by Keith Prather and Larry Gross. Keith covered trucking and Larry covered intermodal as he is off to do. And together we provided this North American economic and freight outlook. So I really talked about, and I'll talk about right now, the big picture, the demand factors around what drives the freight industry, what drives freight rates, what drives capacity utilization, employment, investment, expansion affecting the freight logistics industry. So I started with the big picture. I'm not the macroeconomist, but I carry the messaging on behalf of those to say, well, what's going on? Where are we in the economy? Freight is derived demand. You only have freight transport when somebody wants to buy something, or they need to restock the inventory, or something has to be repositioned. Or they got to get rid of some scrap or something and move it off-site somehow. That's all driven by the economy. So the strength of the economy is fundamental to understanding what's the outlook. And looking ahead, my perspective yesterday was not the super long term. It was really just looking out 6 quarters. The second half of this year, which we're halfway through, or we are as of yesterday, and then really all of 2026, and talking about what's likely ahead of us, with a baseline forecast perspective, but understanding with this enormous volatility around policy issues, especially on trade this year, you really need to have some plan B and maybe plan C in mind in terms of being able to do planning for your business, your supply chain, where you are in the industry, so you don't get blindsided, you don't get caught out. But most supply chain managers and decision makers already know that. They learned those painful lessons in the pandemic, and they're not going to get caught out similarly again.
Sure.
But so where are we? We're in an economy that's running below its potential. We had forecasts that I compared that we had done last year. Really, we had done them at the end of October, before the November election in 2024. So it was a baseline looking at the conditions in the economy globally, things like interest rates, levels of employment, capital spend, consumer spending, capital investment, that were on a trend where the Federal Reserve Board had been lowering interest rates. We had some stimulus coming in that direction. We had some green shoots where industrial production was picking up a little bit off the floor that's driven the freight recession in the last few years. So at that time, we had a forecast that said, we weren't going to be back in boom times in 2025, but we were not predicting a downturn. And we're still not predicting a recession, so I should qualify things right off the top. But what we've suffered instead is a forecast that didn't achieve the levels that we had been forecasting in 2024 for 2025. This is an economy that's growing more slowly, and in fact is to the point now with unemployment increasing that the Federal Reserve Board again has started to lower interest rates again as a stimulative measure because they're concerned with some slowdown signs in the economy, such as creeping unemployment.
Sure.
Looking forward, what does that mean? In terms of the business activity itself, companies have been facing higher interest rates than otherwise they would have faced if the Federal Reserve Board had continued to be reducing interest rates like they had been in 2024 through 2025. So their capital costs have been running higher. And then you combine that with the enormous uncertainty around trade policy, where your supply chain is not at all stable in terms of your costs. Trying to estimate landed costs when you don't know either your direct tier, first tier suppliers or your other tier suppliers, what those imported goods are going to cost or what the cost pass-through is going to be from other suppliers. Or in some cases, even if you're purchasing domestically, if those domestic producers, now protected by tariff walls, are going to raise their prices. And that happened in the steel market. We saw domestic steel producers actually raise their prices up to what those tariff levels were on the imports. So if you're a big steel purchaser, then you faced, even if you weren't buying any imports, you were faced with higher prices. So inflation happens, and that's a factor. Now, some critics have said, inflation, really, we haven't seen the signs of inflation. Well, we've said all along that this inflation happens with a lag. It's not instantaneous. It's not the product on the store shelf, the minute that tariff goes into effect, has its price increased, that you are paying it at the store. It's that end of the supply chain. It has to work its way through the inventory, has to work its way through the supply chains, through wholesalers and retailers. And there's a hesitancy on the part of businesses to raise prices. They're always hesitant to do that for fear of that, economists call it the price elasticity of demand. Are they going to miss out on some sales when they do that?
Right.
So they try to hold off, and they have. And you've even heard retailers say that. They've said, we've been, as long as we can, we're trying to hold off and not raise prices.
And some manufacturers, I heard, held their contracts that they had committed to for 24.
Absolutely.
So they were saying price increases are going to be more negotiated here at the end of this year looking forward.
Exactly. If you got that 12-month contract, you don't face that price increase right away. It's when that contract renewal comes up for 2026 that you're faced with that influence. So we have been saying all along that structurally in the economy, inflation doesn't happen immediately from tariffs.
Right.
And that's just logic. If people think about it, well, of course, it's not going to be instantaneous. But it does happen. Eventually, those manufacturers overseas cannot eat all the cost. That's been the premise that we've heard sometimes on the part of the administration right now, that somehow magically all of these manufacturers globally selling into a global market are going to eat all, through their available margins and not going out of business, they're going to be able to eat the entirety of these tariffs. And that's just not true. It's not possible. So eventually, those prices have to pass through, and they will get passed through. And you've heard that in guarded language on the part of retailers that eventually they're doing that. And you've seen them even in their quarterly earnings statements where they say they're anticipating going forward in 2026 having to elevate some of their prices.
And so where do we sit currently? Because some of the, depending on who you read and how people interpret it, some of the inflation data is still showing us closer to a 3% right now than we are a 2%.
That's right. So we are running at inflation rates that are higher than we had been forecasting a year ago. We would be at this time. We had forecast that we would be approaching that Federal Reserve Board 2% target by the end of this year. That's off the table right now. And in fact, we have sort of what's a bubble where inflation is actually picking up. It's gone up from below 2.7% up close, breaching whether it's core inflation where you take out food and energy or not, but we're up around 3%. And we are forecasting in this fourth quarter of 2025 that we're going to peak at inflation of 3.8%.
Wow.
So we have inflation coming at us, but that's going to be a peak. The markets adjust. When the tariffs are applied, it raises that price level. But unless you continue to raise the tariffs repeatedly, that works through the system. Basically, you adjust to the new higher prices. Demand falls a little bit in terms of those higher price levels, but through the entirety of the supply chain, you adjust to those new higher price levels.
If we're going to say that that's peak in Q4, Does the Federal Reserve have the confidence to continue, monetary policy easing, saying that's peak?
That's one of the questions, and we believe that they have some of the same logic that we do, that if the tariffs indeed are worked through the system, that eventually that element that's boosting inflation temporarily with a lag then also works its way out of the system. And our current forecast is we have inflation then trending down through 2026, so that by the time we get to 2027, we're going to be back closer to that 2% trend. Okay. And we believe that the Federal Reserve Board is justified in balancing their dual charter of managing inflation and managing against unemployment to continue to be stimulative, to return to that path they had been on in 2024, managing back to that 2% target rate. And that we don't know exactly the timing. We had been forecasting before this first reduction that they just did that it was going to be a little later this year when they would do that first reduction. We're now not sure in the next meetings that remain this year whether they're going to do another one. It's going to depend on the job numbers, but now we have a government shutdown and we may not be seeing the job numbers. So there's a little bit more uncertainty again.
Do we have a gauge on the likelihood of that happening? I mean, we've come so close to so many government shutdowns, but I feel like this one's a little bit more...
It's shut down right now as of midnight last night. The question is, how long is it going to last? I really have no inside knowledge, even though I worked in Washington, D.C. for 20 years.
Darn it, I was hoping you did.
But our macroeconomists, just because of the politics that are involved, where they feel that because of the stance both sides have taken, it's unlikely that we're going to get a quick resolution, by Friday night or something. Right. It's much more likely that this will be some period of time that'll play out as there's some, positioning and jockeying. And we have estimated, almost at random, but not entirely, it's probably a 2-week shutdown. Okay. But we have precedents in the first Trump administration of an over a 30-day shutdown. And in fact, that's possible. Both sides are pretty far apart, and if they think there's political advantage to be gained, this could extend out quite a ways. And that has also an impact on the economy. As you reduce that government spending, as a lot of processes that depend on parts of the government functioning, like permitting and inspections and other things that have to happen to facilitate business, if that's all paused, that hurts business separate from the government reduction in spending. So it hurts the economy in the fourth quarter, and you don't get all that back, even if you put everybody back to work. Some of that doesn't come back.
So what are we looking at for a freight market as we head into 2026? Because you talked about hopefully easing inflation throughout 2026, heading towards 27. Hopefully we see some confidence with the Federal Reserve to into 26 ease interest rates. I know that just like with inflation, those are going to act with a little bit of a lag. But I think it was one of your counterparts in your session yesterday. He made the point that even moderate improvements in the economy at this point could have a significant impact on our freight market.
Yeah, there's a lot of sectors that are pretty close to being able to sort of regain traction and growth. Housing is one of them. Instead of everybody being frozen in place with the low mortgage rates they have, if you can bring down some interest rates, bring down some mortgage rates, then some folks with mortgages out there, might consider selling again. Whereas today they're like, well, gee, I face a higher mortgage if I move out of this house. But if they start coming down, then that goes away as somewhat of an impediment. You might see more traction. Then you might see some housing start to pick up again. The associated freight that supports that through the supply chains that support building and construction. And you'll have lower capital costs as the interest rates come down for some businesses. You'll see businesses also, if there's more stability on the tariff side, if some of this plays out where there's certainty, even if they're in place at higher rates, like we're actually forecasting, at least if they can plan against it, then we expect that some of the postponed business activity will proceed. We'll have some capital investment, we'll have more spending, and that'll start to drive through the industrial side of the economy, the industrial freight, the industrial production, manufacturing production portions of the economy. We're not talking a boom here, but it would be growth at a pace faster than we've had in what we're seeing right now and toward the end of 2025.
Yeah, and I think some of those numbers, looking at the growth predictions, while, like you said, not a boom, I think that they would be enough to give some of the relief that's needed for some of the carriers navigating the markets.
Yeah, there's also still some capacity coming out. We've seen moves on the part of US DOT to try to remove some additional questionable actors that are still out there in the driver workforce. That that reduction in capacity at the margin matters. That was mentioned yesterday as well. It doesn't take a lot, but if you take out some additional capacity, get a little bit stronger demand growth, at the margin, you might just see some of those rates coming up.
I think it was Mazen from Uber on my podcast a couple weeks ago who mentioned that we had those major revisions to the BLS labor data,
yes.
And he said that part of that was also a revision to our trucking employment data. So it seems that maybe as we're still sifting through this data, we actually attrited more carrier driver capacity in the last few months than we had originally thought because of those number revisions. And
That's right.
So I think when you talk to people who are involved talking to these carriers every day, like these brokers,
yeah.
they're losing carriers. They're like, well, they're
right.
shutting down, they're going out. So we've been attriting some capacity, and then you're right. I think whether these mandates have a large effect or a minimal effect, it's still capacity that's being
right.
removed from our market. And I think that kind of sets the stage going into next year, where we get even just a moderate economic recovery compared to where we've been. And we see that gap that we have right now between supply and demand start to close.
Yeah, I mean, another factor that's related to that is the immigration deportation policy. That's weakening some of the other sectors, and our economists had actually foreseen that back in 2024, saying this would hit agriculture, hit construction. When you see the labor markets tighten up in construction, sometimes that can draw away some CDL holder truck drivers that would like to be home every night. And that might also draw some additional capacity out if they feel that, wages are going to come up a little bit with a stronger demand environment on the construction side. So it's another indirect factor, but might benefit in terms of the rate environment for the carriers in terms of what we might actually see in 2026. There's a lot of factors at play here, but, together what our analysis was is that I wouldn't say we're being tremendously optimistic, but at least we're saying guarded that there could be some strong enough growth that we start to exit this freight recession we've been in for 3 years in 2026.
Awesome. Well, do you have any other thoughts or advice to leave us with here as we close out?
I'm really hoping in 2026 we don't have the same level of disruptions and uncertainties from policy and other reasons that we've had for the last few years. Ever since the pandemic, all of the supply chain managers and planners and policymakers, it seems every year there's a new source of disruption, new source of turmoil, more challenges that eat away at our personal lives where we're working overtime trying to do our jobs because things have changed on us.
Yeah.
We're hoping for some more stability in 2026 so we can all get back to what we really want to do and know how to do really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for anyone who didn't get to attend the conference this year but is considering it for next year, what would be your recommendation on why someone should consider joining us next year?
Well, I think we've seen this year that you get a lot of insights if you come to this conference. This is not a trade show exhibit-oriented event. This is one that is designed and run by journalists who are reporting, key actionable information with the key decision makers and the leaders that are going to influence what's going on. Right now, I just came out of a meeting, a session with the UP CEO, Jim Vena, talking about what his plans are with some very tough questions that Ari Ash was asking him. Very consistent across the board. Yesterday, we had the CEO of Schneider National. There's many other players here that you get to interact with personally if you come to this conference. It's not so big that you get lost either. This isn't 10,000 people in a big exhibit hall. We're talking, it's growing. I think we're up about 700 people this year. But you have an opportunity if you come here, beneficial cargo owner, whatever your role is in the industry, you actually get to interact with carriers, you get to interact with shippers, and there's enough break time and networking to actually meet with people and make some substantive conversations that can help your business. So I encourage you, if you can find a way, the time and the budget to commit to come next fall, I think you'll really get a lot out of it.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me while I'm here for the conference, and for sharing everything you shared yesterday on stage here on the podcast as well. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Very much.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for meeting us for coffee today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Meet Me for Coffee podcast. We're recording on-site at the Journal of Commerce Inland Distribution Conference this week. If you like this episode, be sure to check out our channels where we'll have multiple others published here this week with content from the show. And in just a couple of weeks, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming, discussing where freight markets and economics meet. I hope you guys can meet us for coffee.